Okay, I have got 12, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Dr. Becky Bowling. Thank you guys for joining us for another edition of Chat with Green Aggies. Today we are going to talk about burrs, and I'm going to focus a lot on Sandburg because that's a weed that I get a lot of questions about this time of year, but we'll also have some discussion about some of our kind of winter burr weeds as well that we will see germinating here in the fall. So we'll discuss some of that as well. And I'm going to keep the chat window open. So certainly if you have questions throughout or you want us to talk more about something, feel free to just put your questions there in the chat and we'll try to make sure that we get to those today. Let's see. I'm going to do this. Alrighty. So let's go ahead and just get right into it. So I get a lot of questions about this because, of course, when it comes to burrs or burr weeds or anything like that, not only are they just another weed that we have to deal with, plant out of place, plant that's growing in an area that we don't want it, but they also are painful. They can get into our pets' paws. They can get into our kids' shoes. I get questions about this sometimes from sports field managers because they'll have issues with it appearing on athletic fields. And so you think about a child running, playing, falling on some of these burrs and getting those lodged in their skin. That can be an issue. About a year ago, I went out to visit the Ector County Cemetery, which is in Odessa, and they were having really bad issues with Sandbur, as well as puncture vine all throughout their 60-acre cemetery, and it had gotten so bad that the grounds crew was having to wear chaps and goggles, face masks when they went out to weed eat because the burrs were being kicked up into their face. They were having issues with the puncture vine seed heads puncturing wheelchair wheels from people that were visiting the cemetery. So this can be a very different kind of weed issue that goes beyond aesthetics and can create other challenges for us. I did want to start off kind of reiterating some cultural and mechanical control tips that I think can be applied to most of the weeds that we're going to talk about today. So a lot of these burr weeds, Sandbur included, tend to proliferate in very nutrient poor soils. So soils where we have nutrient deficiencies, sandy soils, hence the name Sandburg, can be particularly prone to this because some of our nutrients will leach very readily from these soils. And these create environments that make it difficult for our turf grasses, our desired turf grasses, to compete with these weeds. And so, so one of the first things that we want to recommend is that if you're seeing a lot of these weeds show up in your turf grass areas in particular, taking steps to modify or address your nutrient management program to try to optimize what's there and what's available for your turf grass system to be healthy. And so, just trying to take a balanced approach, particularly with respect to nitrogen. So, depending on your desired turf grass species, we may recommend some different nitrogen rates throughout the season. So, for example, with Bermuda grass areas, we typically recommend that you apply between 2 and 6 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. Now, if you are dealing with a higher traffic area, those rates are going to be on the higher end. If you're dealing with an older, more established area that tends to be more of a home lawn, you don't have a lot of traffic, then you may be able to err on the lower end. When it comes to all of our other nutrients, phosphorus, potassium, all of our micros, secondary macronutrients, we want to do a soil test at a regular interval to look and see what is needed in order for me to have a balanced fertility program. Okay. So for sandier soils, I did want to make some additional recommendations because, again, some of these weeds can be more of an issue in sandier soils. Doesn't mean that we won't see them in clay soils, but when you are dealing with a really sandy soil, a couple things that you can do to modify your nutrient management program. The first is consider applying more frequent applications at a lower rate, particularly if you're dealing with a more soluble or quick release product, okay? This just allows that turf grass to take that nutrient up before there's an opportunity for it to be leached readily through that sand past the root zone. So where we may, in a clay soil, we may be able to get away with applying nitrogen at a rate of 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet in a single application for a quick release product. We may choose to do a 1/4 pound or a 1/2 pound in a sandier soil, but apply it just a little bit more frequently to keep up with nitrogen demand. Another thing that we want to consider is utilizing slow release or organic sources of nitrogen. These are going to persist a little bit longer in these sandier soils and be less prone to environmental losses. So organic forms of nitrogen, certainly it takes a little longer for these products to be mineralized by soil microbes. And then we also have some synthetic forms of quick release or slow release products like polymer or sulfur coated ureas. A lot of people like to use a mixture of quick and slow release products for managed turf grass systems. It can be a little bit more budget friendly sometimes than just relying on slow release. And we do get some benefits from using quick release nitrogen. Sometimes we want rapid uptake and assimilation by the turf. The other thing that we want to do, when it comes to a clay soil, we may be able to get away with sampling our soil every 3 years. Now, our macronutrients can change a little bit more quickly, sometimes depending on how we're managing that area. With a sandy soil, I would typically recommend that you're testing every year. I think that you're going to see that nutrient levels may change more rapidly. Particularly potassium tends to be very soluble. This can, if we have potassium deficiencies in turf, we see that it affects drought tolerance, traffic tolerance, cold tolerance. And so we want to make sure that we're monitoring particularly that potassium level with our soil test on an annual basis and applying potassium as needed. We can also take other steps to bolster soil nutrient and water holding capacity of our sandy soils by doing pre-plant incorporation of a high quality compost material. So if you know that you're going to be planting in a very sandy soil, you may choose to look into a nice rich compost material. We do want to do some analysis on that material before we use it to ensure that it's the right fit for us. Not all composts are created equal. Sometimes we have issues with salt levels in our compost materials. Sometimes they're not as nutrient rich as we would like for them to be. But certainly when we incorporate compost into a sandy soil, we can see increased nutrient and water holding capacity. It helps just to improve the quality of that soil overall and bolster our turf health. You can also apply compost after the fact as a top dressing material. You can do this in conjunction with a cultivation practice like aerification. Now, if you choose to do this, I recommend, again, that you get something that's sieved, high quality, and that you don't apply too much at one time. We do sometimes have issues where people will get very heavy-handed with this, and they'll end up creating a layer on top of their soil that becomes a barrier for water movement. It can actually smother the turf. So I would recommend that you keep it at about 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch at each top dressing application. Don't overdo it. Just do a little bit at a time and see what kind of benefits you get. And again, combining this with aerification can help move that product into the root zone so that you get a little bit more benefit than it just sitting there on top, okay? Of course, anytime we have a pest infestation, and weeds are no different, if those weeds are flowering or producing seed heads, we do want to, during that period, bag and remove clippings in order to minimize. A lot of the weeds that we're going to talk about today are annuals, and to the best of our ability, we want to minimize how much of that seed is making contact with the soil to become an issue for next year. Okay, so here's our first weed that we're going to talk about. And again, we're going to focus on this one in a little bit more detail today. So this is Sandbur. We have several different types of Sandbur here in Texas. We do actually have both an annual and a perennial species of Sandbur present. So I've got the scientific names down here for you guys. And there are some others that we would throw into the mix as well. This is a grassy plant. So the other two kind of burr weeds that we're going to discuss today are actually broadleaf plants. And so the herbicide programs that we would implement in order to address these weeds are going to be very different for this weed as opposed to some of the others that we're going to talk about. This is in the Poaceae family. This is going to be most active during summer months, okay? So typically it's going to germinate or return in the spring during transition. And we're going to see it actively grow throughout the summer. I was out walking about 2 weeks ago and started to definitely see burrs appear on plants here in my neighborhood. So typically by about mid to late summer, those burrs and seed heads are going to become very present, and then they will continue to be problematic for us throughout until forever, pretty much, right? Until they germinate and become new plants if it gets to that point. So One thing that we know about Sandbur is that it's got a pretty broad germination window. This can be one challenge that we face when we're trying to design a successful pre-emergence program to address this weed. So just to kind of review, a pre-emergence herbicide is a herbicide that we use as a kind of preventative measure. It forms a type of barrier on the soil and it interferes with seedling emergence. So as weed seeds germinate and begin to try to emerge and come out of the soil, the herbicide interferes with that process so that we reduce the number of weeds that come up in the first place. These types of products are going to be the most effective on annual weeds, typically because they're designed to interfere with that seedling emergence process. If we're dealing with weeds that are coming up by other means, in other words, tubers or rhizomes or perennial weeds that have already been established and are coming back, some of these pre-emergence herbicides are not going to be as effective. Now, we have seen Sandbur germinate as early as around 52 degrees Fahrenheit soil temperature. So as a frame of reference, typically we see crabgrass germinate at around 57 degrees Fahrenheit, which means that this weed can actually germinate earlier than our crabgrass can. So if we're, depending on how we're kind of timing our initial spring pre-emergence application, we may see some breakthrough coming up prior to our initial application. A lot of times we recommend that a spring pre-emergent go out at around 55 degrees Fahrenheit soil temperature. Well, how do I know what my soil temperature is? You may be asking. So there are some applications that will track this for you sometimes, especially if you're in a major metropolitan area. You can typically find soil temperatures for your area. But what I might recommend is that you just invest in a thermometer to help you track this. You can purchase soil thermometers specifically kind of for this purpose online. You can also use like a kitchen or a meat thermometer, provided that the temperatures go low enough. So it'll read low enough temperatures for what you want to do. And typically we're looking at taking temperature for the upper inch or so of soil where the majority of our weed seeds are going to be concentrated. Okay, and this thermometer can help you to track soil temperatures, not just for Sandbur, but for all of our major weeds, as well as preventative fungicide applications too. So again, Sandbur can germinate very early, but we typically see it hit peak germination at around 72 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit soil temperature. So this is much warmer than we will see crabgrass germinate. So what this means is our pre-emergent program that we typically recommend for crabgrass control, which is the main weed that kind of informs our spring pre-emergent control program in turf. This program may kind of miss the mark when it comes to Sandbur, and we may have to modify our program if Sandbur is a predominant weed that we're dealing with in the landscape. So in order to address this, we may consider implementing a split or sequential spring application program. This means that we're going to apply a pre-emergent twice. There's kind of two ways to do this, okay? And some of this is going to depend a little bit on the product that you're using and maximum use rate recommendations, okay? So a split application means that we take the standard rate that we would typically apply for a spring pre-emergence application, and we divide that in half. And we apply half of it at one point in the season, and then we apply the other half at typically 6 to 10 weeks later, depending on label specifications, okay? So for example, let's say that I wanted to use Surfland, which is one of our labeled products for Sandbur control. Well, there is a program on there for doing a split application in the spring. Okay, so I might make my first application when I would normally get out there to target my crabgrass. So once my soil temperatures hit around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, I may make my initial application, and then my sequential or my second half of my rate I may apply about 8 to 10 weeks later. Okay, now some of these products have some restrictions around how early we can put them out, and they may recommend that you do not apply at temperatures cooler than 55. Okay, so we may be tempted to do it a little earlier, again, to kind of accommodate some of these early germinating plants that may come up, okay? But just make sure that your herbicide label allows for that and that you're not going to create turf injury by applying too early in the season. And again, just keep in mind that, you know, while we may get a few plants germinating earlier, again, the peak germination is going to be much warmer. So if you can make your standard application at around 55, and then your next application about 6 to 8 or 8 to 10 weeks later, depending on the product, you should have some pretty good coverage leading pretty late into the spring and into early summer. Now, the other option is that we can do what's called a sequential application, and this is where we use a full rate twice in the spring, okay? And we have some products that allow us to do this. Dithiopyr Dimension is an example of one product where we can apply it at a relatively high rate, I think as many as 3 times within a year, okay? So again, paying really close attention to what the label allows us to do. How many times can I apply this product before I exceed the maximum use rate? It's also important to keep in mind that many of the products that we're about to talk about have the potential to interfere with turf grass growth, okay? So we don't want to get too heavy-handed with this product. You know, we're applying these in the spring. This is a critical transition season where our turf is coming out of dormancy, and if I get too heavy-handed, these products could interfere with that process. We also want to make sure that we're not applying these products to turf that is not fully established yet. So if we just planted this the previous fall and it really hasn't had a chance to get very well rooted, then we may want to skip that first spring pre-emergent application with some of these products to avoid injuring the turf. Again, the label is going to be pretty specific about newly established or newly planted turf. And we also don't want to apply these products if our turf grass is weakened or compromised in any way. So if I experienced a severe late season drought or some kind of injury, maybe I had a fall armyworm infestation late in the fall that just kind of decimated my turf and it hasn't really had a chance to recover yet, again, I may not want to rely too heavily on pre-emergence herbicides that may slow down my turf's ability to recover. So, products that are labeled for pre-emergent control of Sandburg, okay, one of these is going to be Dimension or Dithiopyr. We can find Dithiopyr in some other products. This is a group 3 pre-emergent herbicide. Means it's a mitotic inhibitor, okay? And it inhibits cell division in the plant. On the product label for this product, it indicates that you may need to use higher use rates to control Sandbur in particular. This is also a product that I do like to recommend for spring weed control because if you do also have a crabgrass problem, Dithiopyr has some early post-emergence activity on crabgrass, which gives you a little bit of flexibility with your application windows. It's a little bit more forgiving. If you miss your initial germination of crabgrass, it'll help control some of those little plants that have come up. All right, we can also utilize freehand. This is going to give us 2 different active ingredients that fall into 2 different herbicide groups. So you may not know what I'm talking about when I mention herbicide groups. So let me just touch on this really quickly. You know, all of our pesticides are classified by the way that they work on the pests that they target. Okay, and so in weeds and herbicides, we're now referring to this as the site of action, and weeds are herbicides are classified according to their site of action or how they work. Our goal in designing a successful herbicide program, particularly for professionals that are using products a lot, is to not rely too heavily on any one site of action. So we want to always be mindful of the products that we're using, the site of action associated, which is classified by the group that they're in, and we want to do our due diligence to rotate the sites of action that we're using and use other sites of action in mixed products, okay? Here's another one, Tower. So this has one of those same actives that's in freehand. This one is labeled just for partial control or suppression, so I wouldn't recommend using this product by itself if you're really looking to put a dent in Sandburg control, but it is on the label, so I thought I would include it. Indaziflam Spectacle. This is a group 29. This is a very effective pre-emergent herbicide. It does come with a little bit higher price tag. Okay, so that's something to kind of be mindful of. There are also some use restrictions around this that, you know, may not be able to use it in certain turf systems or soil types or environments. This is also something that I would typically classify, you know, for many of these, I would label them as professional grade products. Okay, so if you're a master gardener watching or a homeowner watching, some of these products may not be as available to you as they might be to a professional, but some of these active ingredients, like Dithiopyr is one, we can find in box store formulations. And so what you'll want to do is, you know, go look at your box stores or your co-op or whatever it is. And, you know, if you find a herbicide product that says weed preventer on it, usually it's going to contain a pre-emergence herbicide, and you can look on the active ingredient listing on that product for products like Dithiopyr, okay, or pendimethalin is another one that we will commonly find in some of our box store herbicides. We even do have BioAdvanced produces one product. It's a 3-in-1 product that does contain indaziflam, okay, but it's a pretty low rate. Surfland is another. This is a benefin and a razzolin combined into one product. This is also a group 3 product. Okay, so several different options here with respect to pre-emergence herbicides for us to kind of explore. And, my recommendation is that, if you are a professional in particular, and this is a weed that you commonly deal with managing, that you do a little bit of experimentation to see what works well for you with the types of soil that you're dealing with and the environments that you're managing. Unfortunately, there have not been as many studies on Sandbur control as we have for some other weeds. So, this has led to kind of a gap in knowledge to some extent as to how these products will perform, particularly in different soil types and different systems. Here's another product. This one's fairly new. It's called Coastal. It contains several active ingredients that have been around for a long time, but it combines them into one product. So it contains simazine, imazaquin, and prodiamine. So you get 3 different herbicide groups represented in using this product. So we see that it does have pre-emergence activity on Sandbur, and it also offers some post-emergence suppression. Particularly I would say as a function probably of this imazaquin, which is the active ingredient that we find in Image. This is a labeled product for post-emergence control. So we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So, so these are all of your kind of labeled pre-emergence options for you to look at. And again, I would do a little research, review the label. You can get on and find most of these labels in PDF format, which makes them typically searchable depending on the company. And look at, what does it look like for me to do either a split or sequential application. Now, one of the potential downsides of a split application is that you're applying each time at a lower rate. So I may see an impact on efficacy of that product. Okay, so I'm getting a longer window of coverage, but each time I'm not maybe using it as effective of a rate as I might otherwise. And then again, yes, so Brad's asking, can I explain what group 3 is? So again, that's how the herbicide is classified by its site of action. These are the groups assigned to them by the Weed Science Society of America, or the WSSA. And group 3 is going to be our microtubule assembly inhibitors, or you may hear the term mitotic inhibitors. This is also the group that contains our dinitroaniline. So these are products that, again, they interfere with cell division in the plant. And typically, most of our group 3 herbicides are going to have more pre-emergent activity, but there are some examples that are more post-emergent. Okay, so if we're thinking about post-emergence control, so we talked about pre-emergence herbicide. Post-emergence herbicides are going to be those products that we use once the weeds have germinated and emerged and have become visible. Now, post-emergence herbicides are typically going to be the most effective when they are applied early in the season when weeds are small and immature. As weeds mature, they develop several mechanisms that make it more difficult for some of our herbicide products to be effective. So their skin becomes thicker. Okay, they typically form a thicker cuticle. They may also, all right, Brad, I'll address your question here in just a second. So they may also form pubescence. They may become, which is hair on the leaves. They may become kind of woody. They also become larger, which can be make it more difficult for products to move through. So we want to try to get these weeds when they're relatively small in order for these products to be the most effective. This can be challenging for weeds like Sandbur and other grassy weeds that tend to blend in with our turf. So it requires some very diligent scouting on our part and kind of monitoring in the late season when we can really identify those weeds and say, oh, okay, so I know now that I have Sandbur, and next spring, summer, early in the season, I need to be watching for that particular weed. So before we get into post-emergence recommendations, Brad is asking about Surfland, creates clubfoot and Bermuda. So group 3 herbicides, those dinitroanilins, all of these microtubule inhibitors that fall into group 3. So if we go back here, you'll see a lot of these pre-emergence herbicides fall into this group. So not just Surfland, but also Dimension, pendimethalin is going to fall into that group, prodiamine is going to fall into that group. All of these herbicides have the potential to create this phenomenon that you're referring to as kind of a club footing in turfgrass roots. Okay, so again, this gets back to being kind of judicious about following the label, not applying excessive rates, doing some experimentation with application timing, never applying products to turf grasses that are not well established with a robust root system. And, you know, any of these other products that fall into a different group, you know, they may serve as an alternative, but each of them comes with their own risks, right? We know that herbicides, by definition, are designed to help us control and kill plants. And so they all can theoretically pose some risk to our turf grass. And this is why it becomes increasingly important for us, to some extent, to try to find the program that works best for us while staying keeping with label recommendations that are there. Okay, so indaziflam, you may have better luck with indaziflam, but again, there's an associated higher cost of using this product. You may, you know, these are the ones that are labeled for Sandbur. So we have some Preemergence herbicides that may fall into other categories, but they may not be labeled for this particular weed. But I think, you know, when it comes to, if you're seeing a lot of root pruning, okay, or root growth inhibition, you may just need to take a year off from using a group 3 pre-emergent herbicide, or, you know, look at using a lower rate or something like that in order to make that work for you. Okay, so when we are looking at developing a post-emergence control program for Sandbur, we don't have a whole lot of labeled post-emergence options compared to what we might have for some weeds. So one option that we have only if you are in sod production. So this product cannot be used in any other turf system. You cannot use it in lawns or golf or whatever. This is for sod production only. Then you have at your disposal Agilam or Agilox is the trade name of this product. And then if you are using this for sod production, you do want to look at the label. There are some rate modifications for St. Augustine grass as well as Tifway 419 hybrid Bermuda grass. So you'll just pay close attention to that. Celsius is another option that we can use for post-emergence control of Sandbur. This is a professional grade product, but it is not a restricted use product, which means that I get a lot of homeowners that try to use this product. My stance on that is this, okay? Even though there are no restrictions preventing a homeowner or an average person from using some of these products, they typically require greater technical expertise in order to use them. Typically, we have to have an improved understanding of how to calibrate equipment. We have to have some understanding of how to utilize non-ionic surfactants or something similar to improve the performance of the product. And some of these products pose a greater risk to our turf if we use them, you know, under certain conditions. So for example, with Celsius, it's very common for us to see temporary injury to our turf when we use this product in very high heat, okay? So even if you can get your hands on this product, I don't necessarily recommend that you use it without some professional training or a lot of research into understanding how this product works and how to use it properly. But this is one that we can use in a variety of different warm season turf types. It is going to have 3 different active ingredients in it that span across 2 different herbicide groups. So, and one of these actives is dicamba, which is a synthetic auxin. It's typically something that we use for broadleaf weed control. And, you know, there are some hesitations right now to use products that contain dicamba for weed control. Another product, another professional product is going to be Katana. This is flazosulfuron, okay? This has both some pre and some post-emergence activity. I primarily used it for post-emergence control. So this is another option for you to look into. This is a group 2 herbicide. Okay, group 2 are our ALS inhibitors. This is a very, very big group. It contains a lot of products that can do a lot of different things. Imazaquin or Image. This is a product that we can also use that is labeled for Sandburg control. It does have a label stipulation that you probably need to make sequential or multiple applications of this product in order to have effective control over Sandburg. I did want to talk about MSMA briefly because this is a product that used to be used quite a bit for Sandburg control. However, there are EPA use restrictions around this product now, and this seems to be something that still, even though this change was made many years ago, it still seems to be something not everybody is aware of, so I want to talk about it. So in 2009, the EPA started reviewing this product and made some changes to how it could be used. MSMA in turf grass systems can still be used limitedly in sod production, golf courses, and on highway rights of way, okay? It cannot be used on residential turf like home lawn. It cannot be used in parks. It cannot be used on athletic fields, okay? And even those systems that it is labeled for use in, there are use restrictions. You can find information about this very easily on the EPA's website. If you just Google EPA MSMA turf, it'll pull it up for you with all of those explanations. And then finally, group 9, Roundup, glyphosate. This is going to be a non-selective systemic, which means it will kill our grass if we put it on our turf grass, okay? So this is for desperate situations or areas where we have exposed soil and we're comfortable using a product like this. If you do choose to use it in turf grass systems, you need to minimize how much direct contact it comes into with the turf. So you can use physical barriers to do this. You can also, in effect, kind of paint the herbicide on. And so glyphosate is always kind of a go-to option for some of our really challenging weeds. If we look over at what homeowners can use, much smaller list, right? So we do have a homeowner-friendly formulation of imazaquin, which is that image that you see over here on the left-hand side. So the homeowner formulation of this is Image Kills Nutsedge, okay? And it comes in a little bottle. It's like a white bottle with some purple on it. You can get that at some of your box stores and use that to spot treat. And again, you know, follow label recommendations for sequential applications. Usually they'll give you an interval, so you'll reapply at a certain, you know, every couple of weeks after that first application. And again, we can use glyphosate if we're desperate. For many homeowners, my recommendation is that you lean on developing some kind of pre-emergent program, and then you fall back on those cultural and mechanical control recommendations that I made at the beginning. Those are really important, that we bolster the health of our turf to make it more competitive with this particular weed. Now, a couple other weeds that I wanted to kind of bring up before we finish today. These are both winter annual broadleaf weeds that we're about to talk about. So this is Lawnbur weed here. So this is what the little burrs look like. They're kind of like little discs. These always get stuck in my dog's ear hair, okay? They're not gonna be maybe quite as hard and pokey, it's a technical term, hard and pokey as the Sandburrs will be, but they're still very, very unpleasant, okay? And this is what the mature plant looks like. So for our winter annuals, they germinate typically in the fall. We're gonna start to see these burrs show up in the spring, okay? That's when they're gonna, you know, our pets are gonna start tracking them into the house and things like that. This weed is in the Asteraceae family. That's the sunflower family. And again, it is a broadleaf plant. So our approach is gonna be a little different than our approach to Sandbur, which is a summer weed and a grassy weed. Another common winter annual that we will typically see produce unpleasant burrs is Burke Clover. There's a few different species of this that we may see, so and they have different common names associated with them, so you may hear the names Burke Clover, Little Burke Clover, which refers to this Medicago minima, and Burr medic. So these are not actually true clovers, so they are actually medics in the medic family, like black medic, and that's why they have this genus Medicago. Okay, instead of the clover genus, which is Trifolium. They are in the Fabaceae family, so they are in the same family as clover and other legumes. Okay, so what this means is, again, these are weeds that may proliferate in soils where nitrogen is deficient because they have the capacity to produce their own nitrogen. They form symbiotic relationships with bacteria and they fix nitrogen in the soil. We see the same thing with our true clovers, as well as peanuts and soybeans and the other plants that are in this family. So some of those same cultural and mechanical control recommendations I made at the beginning about nutrient management could still be very effective when you're dealing with this particular group of weeds. Here's another one. This is spotted Burke Clover, so very similar, but it is a different species, and it has that distinctive red spot on the center of the leaf. So what I wanted to kind of focus on for these is addressing pre-emergence control programs, because I have gotten a lot of emails in the past about, well, I use this pre-emergent and it doesn't seem to do anything. With these particular weeds, Lawnbur weed and Burke Clover, because they're broadleaf weeds, some of our pre-emergence herbicides, they have limited efficacy on them, okay? So one of the first things to talk about is timing. These are winter annuals, so typically for winter pre-emergence applications, we want to recommend that you make that application when your soil temperatures drop to around 70 degrees Fahrenheit for 4 to 5 consecutive days. The timing around this varies a lot depending on where you are in Texas, okay? So if I'm in far north Texas or up in the Panhandle, I may be starting to look for this in late August, pushing through the month of September, and as I go further south, that date may get pushed further and further into October. So it just kind of depends, and we see some variability from year to year as well. Now, labeled products that we can look at for some of these, okay? Some of our standard mitosis inhibitors like pendimethalin may be labeled for control of these weeds. Simazine or Princep is labeled for control of these two weeds. Now, something to kind of make you aware of, the EPA is currently reviewing the use of simazine in landscape for landscape applications right now. They are also reviewing the use of atrazine. So we want to kind of stay alert and aware of that because there may come a point where we cannot use simazine to control weeds in some of our landscape scenarios. Simazine does have some pre and post-emergence activity in the soil, so we may be able to utilize it on both ends, but again, we don't want to rely too heavily on just one site of action, okay? So this is a group 5 product. We don't necessarily want to rely just on simazine for our weed control. And then this is also kind of important. So you may have heard of the pre-emergent herbicide Gallery. Okay, this contains an active ingredient called Isoxabin. This particular product is designed to be more effective on broadleaf weeds, or it's more efficacious on broadleaf weeds. And so what this means is if I'm dealing with some of these broadleaf spiny burr weeds like Lawnbur weed or Burke Clover, I may want to bring Isoxabin or Gallery into my pre-emergent program. And I can actually combine that product with some of my other pre-emergent herbicides like dithiopyr or prodiamine in order to have really broad spectrum control over weeds. So Isoxabin is not going to be particularly effective on my grassy weeds. In other words, if I've got a really bad POA problem on top of my Burclover or my Lawnbur weed problem, I cannot just rely on Isoxabin because it is not going to be effective on that POA annua. I'm going to need to combine it with some other product. There is a new product out from Corteva called Crew, and it actually pre-mixes Isoxabin and dithiopyr, so you get that mixture kind of made for you, and that's groups 21 and group 3 for the dithiopyr. So that may be a good option to use for your winter weed control. Similar to the spring, we may find that a split or a sequential application for fall pre-emergence herbicides may be very effective for us. Again, if you've got a severe POA annua or annual bluegrass problem, we know that applying a single pre-emergence herbicide one time in the fall just may not be sufficient for us to have control. We actually collected some data last year down in South Texas and found that POA germination was actually bimodal. It had 2 peaks. We had one initial peak in the fall that we knew was going to happen, and then we had kind of a lull and then another peak in January. So you may find that you need to do a split or sequential program throughout the winter to provide you with a barrier of control, particularly in warmer climates where we may not get quite as cold, okay? And then Indaziflame or Spectacle, again, kind of falls into this group too, where we can use this as pre-emergent herbicide. With respect to post-emergence control of some of these broadleaf plants, a lot of our standard broadleaf herbicides like 2,4-D, dicamba, mecoprop, and similar products are labeled to control these weeds. So certainly we can look at using those products early in the season for control. We do want to be mindful of the fact that some of these broadleaf products can be harmful to St. Augustine grass or select cultivars of St. Augustine grass, as well as centipede grass. So we want to pay very close attention to what the label stipulates. If you are in a St. Augustine grass system, atrazine is one option that we may be able to utilize to help control some of these broadleaf weeds when they come up. Atrazine is typically not something that we want to use on Bermuda grass. There's kind of two sides of that coin. And certainly there are many other professional grade products that we have at our disposal to control some of those challenging broadleaf weeds as well. And that's where you may kind of lean on that CDMS advanced label search to give you kind of a feel for what's out there. Or if there's any weeds, you know, that you're looking for some broadleaf, or excuse me, some post-emergence options, just shoot me an email and we can try to come up with a list to help you out and let you explore that. Okay, so that's what I've got for weeds. I want to make sure we don't have any questions about burr weeds before we hand it over to Paul for him to talk to you guys about plant of the week. So if you've got any questions, just throw them into the chat. And I'm going to let Paul get his stuff loaded up real quick.
Okay, hope you can see that. I'm going to talk about two Texas superstars, and they fall into that, what they call the per annual group. So down here, I'm in Houston. There are going to be more perennials, large shrubs, or small shrubs. And the first is this Galphimia, glauca, common name Thyralis, shower of gold. But this plant is really putting on a show this time of year. It's an evergreen, loves the full sun. You can see the image in the corner here. Very nice mounded habit, flowers over the entire plant. And in the close-up, you can see that flower spike starts down here in bloom. You can see where it's already seeded and set fruit, but it continues to bloom. I've seen this, it will withstand the light shearing throughout the season and then just come back and bloom throughout the entire year. If you're having issues, if you're in an area where you've got deer problems, this is considered a deer resistant plant. I would tend to think further north in the state, this will get burnt back with the colder winters. But down here for us, it stays evergreen, and I would say at least 9 months out of the year, this plant's going to have flowers on it. So really nice effect, nice presence in the landscape, works well as a standalone plant, and performs extremely well. The other one is Tecoma, Gold Star. I remember when I first moved to Texas, this was one of the first plants that we were working on at the nursery, and I was just really impressed with it. Another one. So if you're looking for two plants with yellow, to bring yellow into that landscape, this Gold Star Esperanza, this is a found plant again by, I believe it was Greg Grant. But it has these clusters of these bell-shaped flowers late spring into the fall. In this area, in the Houston area, it is semi-evergreen, so depending on how cold we get and how long it stays cold, we'll see back year after year. Landscape height, again, it depends on what part of the state you're in. I've seen them up above 8 feet down in this area over in San Antonio. Value added, it brings in the pollinators. It is deer resistant. And it's another one that you can shear throughout the season to get a fuller plant, and it will continue to bloom throughout the heat of the summer. So if you're looking for two good landscape plants, if you're looking for yellow to bring into that landscape, this Tecoma Gold Star and the Malpighia will both do will perform extremely well. All right, and I guess that is it for me, Becky. So I will turn it back over to you.
So Paul requested that we talk briefly about sod webworm, because he expressed that this is becoming quite an issue down where he is. I don't know if you guys joining us today are having similar challenges. So let's see, let me pull this up real quick.
There you go.
All right, so, and I'm gonna let Irfan chime in when we get to insecticide recommendations, but I just wanna give a little background on this guy first. So Sod webworms, you know, these are Lepidoptera insects, so they're little caterpillars basically. So this is what their adult form looks like. And they vary in color. Okay. When we see them in turf grass systems, a lot of times the larvae tend to take on more of a green color as a function of eating all that green fleshy tissue. Okay, so they'll kind of look like you see here. They typically have pretty distinctive little raised bumps all along the length of their body. In contrast to fall armyworms, so I've got fall armyworm pictures here. You'll see on fall armyworm that we've got these pretty distinctive stripes that run the length of their bodies. And fall armyworms also have a pretty distinctive Y-shaped feature on their forehead. They also have these really cute little 4 black dots on their butt. Okay. And, you know, if we go back and we look at sod webworm, a lot of times their head tends to be a little bit smaller. They don't have that distinctive Y-shaped feature on their head, and they don't have those lines that run the length of their body. Their larvae tend to grow to be about 3/4 to an inch long in size. And their adult form, they have a pretty distinctive triangular shape to them. And then, you know, the other thing that we notice with the adults, typically when they're present, you can spot them in turf. If you kind of walk around in the turf at dusk, they have a distinctive flight pattern when they come up out of the turf. So you can think of this as either kind of a drunk pattern or a serpentine pattern, depending on how much credit you want to give them. But they tend to have kind of a zigzag flight pattern that's pretty distinctive. I can tell you that you know, typically we recommend that you treat when you have 3 to 4 larvae within about a 6-inch area. And for a lot of our turf feeding insects like this, we typically recommend that you mow and water prior to treatment in order to kind of create conditions optimal to get that insecticide where you need it to go. At this point, I'm going to throw it over to Irfan and see what his latest recommendations are regarding chemical control.
Sorry, I just muted you by accident there. I was trying to unmute myself. Yeah, here, I'm trying to get back to the window here. Here we go. I'm going to share my screen here briefly. So there's this excellent publication. It's from 2014, so it's not too far outdated. And I'm going to put the link to this particular publication in the chat so you can access it if you so wish. It is open access, so you don't have to pay for it, which is kind of nice. And they do a nice kind of review, just like Becky just did. If you want to have a more thorough review to know who your enemy is in your turf grass, this Journal of Integrated Pest Management, is really targeted at technical specialists or growers such as yourselves. Pardon me. And in there, they do have an insecticide table with some insecticides to consider. Now, I was looking through a lot of these insecticides and trying to find some research data to support it. A lot of these insecticides here are supported with some reasonable, or at least I should say some data, some of them a little bit harder to come by. So Bavaria bassiana is said to provide good suppression, I think, in this one research article, which is behind a paywall and I couldn't quite get to. But that's one example of something that may work well. Whereas something like imidacloprid, there was a study that showed it did not give very good suppression, but clethoanidin did, and dinotefuran, which is Xylam, also did. However, things to consider with clethoanidin, imidacloprid, and dinotefuran, so Xylam, is that they are in this class neonicotinoids. If you're planting grasses, if you have any wildflowers, or if your grasses are, you have some guttation, right? They're kind of like, letting out these droplets. These are systemic insecticides that are taken up by the plant, and they can be present in those droplets. And they have shown that it can be in high enough concentration to potentially impact pollinators that are coming by and drinking on those droplets, or if you have any wildflowers, certainly impact them through feeding on those wildflowers. So that's just something to be kind of cautious of. If you're trying to reduce impact on pollinators, you might want to curb your use of those particular systemics. Now here we go. So this acyloprin appeared to be another one that provides some good residual and good control as well of those larvae. And you're really trying to target the larvae rather than the flying adults in this case. So again, I mean, here are some other examples of some other insecticides that you may consider, but I think we've just named at least a few. Spinosad being another one that's demonstrated good efficacy in some data that you can consider. Now, I think there is a good mechanical or a way of suppressing them mechanically as well, and that's and Becky, you can correct me here, but from my understanding, they lay their eggs on those blades, and so if you're mowing, you can collect those blades, or you can collect the cuttings and bag them and get rid of them, and that way you can drastically reduce your reinfestation, right? You can basically you're physically removing several of those eggs. So that's one thing to consider there.
Yep, and that's our recommendation. That's good practice anytime you have any pest infestation present, whether it's insect, disease, or weed in turf. Those are good periods where we can bag and remove clippings in order to prevent the spread of whatever infestation we are experiencing, right? So anytime you suspect a problem, bag, remove, and then clean your equipment, okay? Irfan, I did see in the chat somebody had some questions about whiteflies as well. Rebecca Caldwell, she said, anyone else having a tremendous influx of whiteflies? How do we get rid of them?
So it really depends on, it's one of those pests that is incredibly illegal-phagous, right? Like they feed on a lot of different types of crops. So it really depends on what type of crops we're talking about. So if Rebecca, if you could specify if you mean in the landscape or in a greenhouse or whatever crop, that would kind of help. But it's not uncommon, and I'm not too familiar with cotton, being a Green Aggie person, but I do know that especially down further southern parts of Texas, when they harvest that cotton, you can get these huge migrations of whiteflies, right? So those whiteflies can build up their populations in that cotton for a little while. The tolerance for whiteflies on cotton is going to be higher than, say, on ornamentals. And so it's building up. When they harvest that cotton, all those adults are looking for a new place to inhabit. And so they will all of a sudden be raining down on you all over. So that's one possible source of them. Let's see, they're covering rows of Sharon, other roses in the landscape. Yeah, so there are a number of insecticides that can be used on ornamentals in the landscape. I can't remember which episode it was. It was several Green Aggies episodes ago where I discussed management strategies. There are a number of natural enemies, beneficial insects in the landscape. They're going to help suppress their populations. So you want to be kind of selective about if you actually need to spray for them or if you can wait and see if their populations naturally crash. We have been having particular problems with just sustaining our whitefly populations in our greenhouse recently because it's the same greenhouse that we've had some predatory mites. And it seems like the predatory mites have either just lingered or I don't know what's going on, but we cannot reestablish the same type of whitefly colonies that we had. So there are a number. Yeah.
To move all of her plants into your greenhouse. Then.
Into my greenhouse. Yeah. So if you'd like to do that, that'll work. But otherwise, there's a number of insecticides. For a homeowner, you could look at things like neem oil. Make sure under active ingredients you see that azadirachtin, because that's the active ingredient that's going to act as an insect growth regulator against the whitefly immatures. And from a homeowner perspective, you could also consider some drenches, but again, not ideal because the products that are available to homeowners as drenches currently are potentially going to have negative impacts on pollinators because they can, you're not supposed to apply them when the flowers are in bloom. So you're really looking at either azadirachtin or possibly some kind of pyrethroid. But I'm not as familiar with the consumer market as I am, say, with what professionals have access to.
All right. Let's see.
Yeah, so neem oil is going to be okay for pollinators, especially if you're avoiding direct contact. So you don't want to spray the pollinators directly. Even then, I would suspect it wouldn't have a major impact, but I would just caution you not to spray them directly when they are active. And then it'll be okay. Now, neem oil is something you want to be cautious about when you spray, because oils can, burn up your plants if you spray on the, peak heat time of the day. So you want to do it either early morning before the pollinators are out, or probably later in the evening would be better. That's when we find the pollinators are usually not as active, and that gives that some time for that residual to subside before pollinators revisit the next day.
Awesome. Any other questions or things for us to discuss? We're finishing kind of early, but we had a smaller group of us today. So
early, or are we finishing like in a time?
Almost on time.
Yeah.
Which is early kind of for us.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Well, do you want to plug anything? Any latest news on podcasts and things like that for us to talk?
This upcoming Tuesday, so another horticulturalist and myself, we have this podcast that there's a new episode every 2 weeks called Jolly Green Scientists, and it's intended for this audience. All right. So technical specialists in the green industry, whether you're growers or distributors or whatnot. And we just recorded a really fun one, which is basically about, criminal activity as it relates to transporting of insects or plants. So there are some really interesting articles about, these gang rings that will circulate, endangered plants or insects around. And so we have a bit of fun with that one. So that comes out on Tuesday. Any type of podcasting platform, whether it be Spotify or, Podbean or Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, whatever, just look up Jolly Green Scientists and you can listen to those on there.
Yep, and I'm going to make a quick plug for those of you that may or may not be familiar. I work quite a bit with the Water University group up here in Dallas, and we are currently in the process of selling a couple of different things. If you're interested in some fall yard projects and you're up here in North Texas, we've got our pollinator You Plant It boxes for sale, and we have invited Irfan to help weigh in on some of the pollinator background with some of that. So that's something that you can look into. It's a garden in a box, and it comes with a free landscape design, so it makes it very, very simple for you to bring some new pollinator-friendly plants into the landscape without thinking too hard about it. We are also selling rain barrels right now. I actually went and we made about 40 of them this week. So if you're up here in North Texas and you're interested in getting a rain barrel before we start to get our fall rains, just check out our website, wateruniversity.tamu.edu, or shoot me an email, and I'm happy to give you the information that you need. That's all I got. Thanks to Paul for our plants of the week. Thanks to Irfan for weighing in on sod webworms. And
do we need to say anything about jujubes?
Oh, man, we forgot to do our jujube. Well, and we're sponsored today by jujubes.
Jujubes.
It's not a Thursday if you're not talking about jujubes.
You tell Mung's out here when we're not talking about jujubes. Jujube people will be very disappointed.
We're going to have to get team shirts, and they're just going to have jujubes on them.
Yeah, there we go.
All right. Awesome.
All right. Thanks, Banky.
Yeah. You guys have a great day.